Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, depending upon where you're tuning in from. We're really happy to have you here for today's webcast, where we are delving into clinical drivers that are critical to an organization's financial planning and forecasting capabilities. Want to just say hello. My name is Sharon Langen. I head up partnerships and community engagement at Auxilius. I joined Auxilius over 2 years ago. Prior to that, did some auditing in Big Four and spent 20 years in the B2B world working with finance and accounting leaders within the life science community. Like many of you, the output of R&D and the innovation that this industry produces from both a trial perspective and a therapeutic breakthrough perspective, it hits home to me. What I also recognize is there was an underserved area for finance and accounting leaders from a tool perspective around forecasting of clinical trials, which are so important to what we do in this industry. So I am so happy to be here today. I'm joined by two amazing experts in this field. So before we do some quick intros there, I just want to give you a little bit of background of why we're here from Auxilius talking to you today about this topic. You may have heard from Auxilius over recent years or even just in recent months in the webinars that we've been doing and out in the market. But for those new faces, welcome to this session. Different than past sessions, we're focusing today on more of the financial planning and forecasting elements and why that's so important organizationally. Of all operational and resource factors that feed into a biopharma company's financial health and abilities to strategically plan, R&D and trial costs, those top that short list of those decisive factors because they are disproportionately material, sometimes upwards of 70 to 80%. They're difficult to predict, hard to pin down, and the progress of a clinical trial is so paramount to the organization and obviously to investors' interests. So a little bit about Auxilius. We are biopharma industry's first and principal solution, purpose-built to power dynamic driver-based forecasting across a portfolio of trials so that biopharma finance and accounting teams can make informed decisions that is timely and gives visibility. We are working across nearly 70 biopharma companies ranging in therapeutic size, scope, and focus. But that's enough about us. I want to let you know if you have questions or curiosity or want to learn more, you can always reach out to me and to our team or visit us at auxilius.co. But with that, I want to introduce our speakers and presenters for today and do some self-introductions. Maybe we'll start just rounding out the Auxilius team. Erin, if you want to give a little bit of your background.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Erin Warner-Gwill. I'm the president and COO of Auxilius. I've been around since we started the company. And my background is at the intersection of healthcare and finance. So I am a former investment banker, private equity investor, and then I've operated healthcare data and analytics businesses before helping to start Auxilius. I think relevant to today's discussion, I have built hundreds of models in my life. I'm very passionate about forecasting and modeling and excited to talk about this subject with you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Erin. And Robbie Tintoko, it's so great to have you here. We want to thank you for your time and joining us. VP Alkeus. Yeah, Robbie, tell us about your background.
Thank you for having me. So Robbie Tintoko, Vice President of Finance at Alkeus Pharmaceuticals. I've been in the industry for about, I hate to say it, 20 years. It goes by so fast. The first half of my career have been supporting commercial stage organizations. I've launched 4 to 5 products throughout that experience. Midway through my career, I decided to pivot to round up my experience and support drug development stage companies. And that's where I started to learn about supporting clinical development, clinical trials, and the intricacies of such work. Disclaimer, by no means am I the expert in clinical trials and modeling. A lot of my experience comes with on the work, on the job. And I also have had a tremendous team under me who taught me a lot of what I know today, and I hope I can share that with you.
Amazing. That's great. Well, Robbie, I think, it's hard to be an expert in clinical trial finance, but more importantly is like taking that data. And that's what we're here to talk about today and how you are armed with that to make those really important decisions in your role as a financial steward and leader within your organization. Before we dive into things, can you give us a little bit of real quick about Alkeus and like kind of where you're at in your clinical portfolio and pipeline?
Sure. Alkeus has been around for a while, but only recently, and I will say like maybe the past year or two, have we really started forming a true organization, because there's a likelihood that we will file an NDA this year. We are in the rare disease space for ophthalmology, particularly targeting Stargardt disease, and usually when you're in rare disease, the FDA allows you to file on a phase two study. And so we're hoping to file an NDA this year, and then hopefully commercialize, assuming all things go well, hopefully commercialize later in the year, if not early next year. We are conducting a phase 3 study. We're just in the process of getting it started. We're still working on the agreements and everything. And, kind of part of what we're discussing today is like, what are the things that we want to make sure we account for ahead of time as we're setting up these agreements? Like what kind of data, what kind of detail do we want to get out of the CRO? And can they even provide that? So, yep, it'll be an exciting year for sure.
Excellent. Well, we're excited for you. We're very thankful to have you here joining our group. So here's for today, we are going to spend the next 53 minutes together. We're going to talk about the role of clinical metrics, some of the things that Robbie just mentioned. How does that inform organizational financial strategy? Things like capital allocation, project prioritization. So that's what we're going to look at is, the devil's in the details, what we need from CROs, and how you leverage clinical drivers and metrics to inform those decisions that are very paramount. We're going to look at some of the best practices, what we see in the industry today. And then at the end, we'll take a few minutes to look at how does this look in practice and how can we support an Auxilius, and you'll get a demonstration of how that works. So thank you all again for being here. We're going to start by, before we dive into clinical trials and specific trials, we want to zoom out a bit and talk about things like investor interest. We know that for clinical stage companies, investors are highly focused and hyper focused on what is happening on the R&D side, being able to meet that next milestone and value inflection point. Do you have the cash to get there? How do you communicate to stakeholders? What does somebody like Robbie or anyone on the line from FP&A or financial leadership, what do you have to communicate externally to stakeholders? And how do clinical drivers and metrics, how can they strategically inform capital allocation and strategic project prioritization? So you're putting your resources that are very critical to your best bets. So Robbie, we'll start with you here as a financial leader in the industry and for your organization. How do you think about the role, broadly speaking, that FP&A plays? What does forecasting mean in the broader view, and also just the longer term vista for a biotech organization looking far out?
Sure. It's a really great question. And I think especially the past 5 years, when the economy for the pharmaceutical industry had been put into a lot of stress, making it very difficult to raise capital, the role of FP&A had become even more important. Whenever we speak with investors, we communicate, especially when we're about to start a study, right? The main thing investors are interested in understanding is like, when will they get data that suggests that your drug works, right? Bottom line. And in order to do that, we kind of communicate little bits of milestones pertaining to our study, be it when do we expect the first patient to come in? When do we get the sites up and running? And then we might give maybe a target timing of when, let's call it an interim readout might come out. And so the moment you commit something like that, especially externally to investors, there is a lot more, you're put more under a microscope. And these investors truly want to understand, like, are you meeting these goals that you've committed to? So internally, especially in finance, we really want to understand, okay, we this is our current state from a capital perspective. This is what the investors know we have today, and we need to hit these milestones. We want to know if we are on track based on our cash resources today, whether we're on track to meet those, and where are the risk areas. And you can't just get that from having a qualitative conversation with the CRO. A lot of times the devil is in the details. And sometimes you do have to know what to look for, to be able to assess for yourself and gain comfort for yourself that you are hitting, or you are on the path to hit those milestones. And I say this from experience in that a lot of times, for example, patient enrollment is a strong indicator of whether you're going to hit those milestones, right? You start off your projections with a thought that you're going to enroll X number of patients, and that'll go on until you hit the total number of patients that you needed at a certain point. And if you are lagging in that regard, then you know that the timing of putting together the information pertaining to those patients will also move. So it's highly important to understand when, like, your patient enrollment path, like how quickly that will go. Otherwise, if there are delays, with every delay means that this trial will last longer, which means additional expenses, right? So there was a time when we used to rely on what the CRO said, because that's the only point of information we have. And when that happens, you really are beholden to whatever they tell you. And what we're seeing, like what I've experienced in the past is the CRO will tell you one thing, but when you're looking at how the actuals are coming through, you're like, there's no way we can reach that. And it becomes clear that what they're sharing with you is their aspiration versus the reality.
Yeah.
And so having a little bit more control in analyzing the true trajectory of your enrollment curve, I think is empowering for financial planning teams.
Absolutely. So I think patient enrollment, that's a really good point. Patient enrollment is one of those kind of like check engine lights, like indicators that something might be off here. What are some of the other things that you find in addition to that, but makes it hard to forecast and be able to get that kind of readout that is important externally for external stakeholders, investors, the board? What are some of the things that make forecasting hard in clinical trials outside of enrollment?
Yeah, I think, obviously the patient enrollment is one thing, but like taking a step back, it's getting the sites up and running, right? You have to know from the get-go that the CRO that you're working with is the right partner for you. And, we go into these agreements with the utmost confidence, after having sat with the CRO and everything. But a lot of times it's also changes in strategy. For example, I was at a company where the initial strategy was to enroll patients within the US borders. And then COVID hit. And aside from that, there was competition to get those same patients. Mm-hmm. And as a result, we found that we actually had to expand outside of the US. And that particular CRO just did not have a presence outside of the US. And so we were finding it very difficult to project when we would actually get sites up and running, which ended up running up cost, right? Because your CRO is up and running, your program management fees keep going, and you're trying all these sites. Mm-hmm. So knowing how quickly you can get the sites up and running so that they can start enrolling patients is one cost driver that can be very difficult if you don't have more detail behind it, other than relying on the CRO's information. The second piece that's probably quite tough to predict in clinical studies is the investigator payments, investigator fees. And this is kind of like where I feel the more downstream it is in the study, the more difficult it is to predict. especially with sites, investigator sites, a lot of times they invoice quite late. And the CRO can only provide you information that the sites provide them. So, what we found, for example, and this comes down to capital allocation, is you take information from the CRO, investigator information from the CRO, and warranting that the information they have is very, very good. And as a result, you kind of you use that for your forecast, and from there you reallocate your budget based on the information that you have. What we've experienced is that all of a sudden we get $500,000 to $1 million of unexpected invoices from sites that we had been using, or that had maybe closed out from a previous study even, saying that you owe them money and you didn't plan for that. But you were told that you had all the information on hand. That can really put a dent, and especially in a small company that's truly trying to allocate every dollar, right? And I say this too from the current economic state where every dollar matters, and we use them purposefully. So it goes back down to, a lot of times we don't want to go too detailed where it's not meaningful, but we want to focus on the meaningful areas, the meaningful drivers in clinical studies that really drive up costs, that such that if we could get more detail behind it or more control behind it, I think it would be very useful.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there's an expectation that you have all of the information in front of you and readily available. But as we know in practice, and we can delve into this a little bit more, it's not in the level of detail always that you expect or need. And it's actually not at the time that you need it. It's not real time. There's a lag. So it poses a substantive problem from a broader level organizational strategy perspective, external relations, explaining to investors and conveying to the external stakeholders, this is where we're at, this is where we expect to be, and we can stand against this forecast at this point.
Exactly. I'm just the type of person that likes having a little bit more ability to push back and challenge the CRO with their expectations, and I feel like I could get that by having my own touch point on the data rather than just fully beholden to their information.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we jump into a poll, because I want to get from the group that's on the line. So if you all can kind of stay eagle eyes here for the poll question that we will launch, and we, because without leading with the answer to the test, I think it's important. We would love to understand when you think about not only capital allocation but managing cash runway, which for clinical stage companies that are public or private, it's a huge organizational challenge at this point. And so want to know what you deem most important, but maybe we can pop up that poll. But Erin, I wanted to give you a chance if there's anything that you wanted to add here, what you see across 70 companies that you're working with in the biopharma space today.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-up question from Robbie, because I think what we're trying to make sure we can provide for our folks who've joined us today. Robbie, you mentioned the challenges, having good kind of own view on when you expect site activation to happen, having your own view on patient enrollment. What is your source of truth? So you talked about don't want to rely on the CRO. I think we can talk about modeling all day long, but how do you get independent conviction? What are your sources? Can you talk a little bit about how you discuss with your clinical counterparts to get that?
Yeah, there's a lot more challenging that happens because as actuals come, so your source of truth, or at least when you don't have a third party system that kind of assists you, right? Your source of truth ends up being whatever the CRO tells you. Mm-hmm. But what I end up looking at even more are the actuals, right? And then comparing that against the forecasted curve that the CRO provides you. And just way too many times it's it becomes like a hockey stick. And you might accept it for maybe the first round, but then if it's consistently a hockey stick, then you realize, okay, like it's clearly there's no way, right? And you go back to your clinical team, asking them to truly provide more insight as to why they believe what the CRO is saying. And you will get a mix of responses. A lot of times when, somebody who's closer to the study will say, I really don't think it'll happen. But then the people who are higher up, they tend to be the ones that are more positive, saying like, there's an absolute chance because X, Y, and Z. And unfortunately, at least just based on my experience, and there may be companies that have experienced like a jump, right? Like as projected by the CRO. But at least in the past 5 years in the companies that I've worked at, it's always been, the reality has been, it's been a lot slower than the curve that the CRO has been projecting. So hard to say that the source of truth, like there is a source of truth.
Totally.
Unfortunately, the source of truth is what the CRO was providing us at the time.
Yeah. I'll give you a couple of other observations that we see in our customer base. I think we talked a lot about like setting up for contracting with the CROs. Obviously, most of our customers are entering into an RFP process with multiple CROs, and CROs are putting their best foot forward. And a lot of this like potentially optimistic viewpoint is coming from a competitive bidding process. And so I think what we've heard from customers is just being able to calibrate, looking across the RFP, looking across what these CROs are saying and using some sense checking to say, everyone's likely shaving 10% off where this is actually going to be. How can I conservatively apply a buffer so that I don't get hosed when the CRO comes back and says, oh, looks like I have more turnover in my staff. Let me supplement the training budget relative to where we expected. We always see that on the investigator side. They say, here's the average patient cost. Robbie, you already kind of mentioned this, but then like comes in and your enrollment is much more concentrated at high cost sites that are quite different from that average patient cost that was cited. So I think just taking it kind of back is like, in addition to the internal challenges of like not necessarily having the exact view from your optimistic clinical operations team, you're also contending with that like competitive bidding process from the CROs, and that's a little bit of what's also informing that kind of source of truth.
There certainly is, and that's why the bidding process is very important. A lot of times, companies tend to just go with the CROs that they've maybe had a previous experience with. But a lot of times that may not necessarily be the right approach. And you really have to approach each one differently and compare every bid, right? And the other piece is when you negotiate the MSA, that's where you really that's where you have the most opportunity to agree on the type of detail and information you have and the types of processes that you follow. Something as simple as having on the MSA, putting in the MSA language that puts maybe penalties if they were to kind of take away key talent from personnel from the study, because as we know from any company, right, like the talent that you have is what drives the company forward, and that goes the same with clinical studies. And if the CRO keeps taking away those key personnel, the ones that you really enjoy working with, then that becomes a problem. So we've since put a practice in place and put language that puts penalties when the CRO does that. We've also put a process in place that allows us to track change orders and be proactive about what comes in change orders, because a lot of times, like these studies, right, will happen, and something will be needed by the clinical study team that is out of scope, and a lot of times they'll just email the CRO to do it in the absence of finance because it needs to be done. And next thing you know, a massive change order comes and finance is completely thrown off guard.
Yeah.
So we've since put in processes that allow the clinical team to keep operating without disturbance, but still allows a sense of control for the finance team.
Yeah.
So all very important to address as part of like the initial stages. I see questions coming from Josh, and I want to make sure I do answer them. Do the actuals include accruals? So when I say actuals, I was referring to like the actual patients that's been enrolled versus the expenses. But when the actuals do come in, like from an expense standpoint, we do include accruals in there. When you ask something about prepaid balances, so this also is something I'm making sure I kind of outline as part of the MSA and the SOW, where there's more of a frequent, rather than, some CROs, right, will ask you for a large prepaid amount. And as a small company, cash is king. You want as much cash in your bank account so that it could be accruing interest or what have you. I'm more comfortable negotiating a term where we forecast every quarter and then just replenish every quarter, and we agree on like a certain amount. Because the problem with prepaid expenses that's supposed to cover out of pocket costs is that sometimes it becomes a bucket used to fund on out of scope activities, and you don't want that, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to understand exactly what you're paying for. So we've gotten into a practice where we have a regular check-in with the CRO, and we reproject and reforecast what they expect out-of-pocket costs to be, and then that's what we fund from a prepaid perspective.
One other, can I just, I want to jump in on this, managing prepaid balances with investigator fees. I think this is the biggest thing that our customers at Auxilius struggle with. And it's not just like the prepaid versus the actuals. I think it's just like having, as Robbie's mentioned, like insight into what the actual investigator spend is going to be. The CRO is projecting those prepaid balances relative to what is going to happen. And if you don't have your own view of what's going to happen, then their escrow amount is going to go
100%
above what it needs to be. And so I think having your own informed view, Auxilius does it with your own clinical data and your site contract information in real time so that you can have that kind of accurate forecast. But I think it's a pretty widespread challenge to account for.
Exactly, Erin. And it goes back to like what I said about having your own data point to be able to push back and challenge, I think is the most important. Otherwise, you're always just taking information rather than really having a conversation that challenges what they say. Martin also had a question: how do you minimize the gap between finance and clinical to support the operations? Really, the best way is to partner with them. I mean, I say that so lightly, but when I started at Alkeus, I literally went to look for the head of ClinOps just to introduce myself and just to tell her that, you know what, I'm on your side. I want to make sure that I wanted her to know that my goal is to make sure that she is focused on operating and I focused on the finances. And she was super appreciative of that, because non-finance people, like the clin operations people or any other function for that matter, they do not want to have to deal with finances. And so to the extent that we can be self-sufficient and then engage the clinical team on more operational stuff, meaning like when I go to my clinical team, I'm almost storyboarding the numbers for her and trying to make sense based on what's happening, because that's where they can really provide value, is tell you exactly what's happening in clinical studies. And then I'm able to take that and then translate it to the numbers and make sense of the numbers. And sometimes I even say, like, the numbers don't jive with what's happening per my CRO partner or clinical partner. And I'm there and I'm able to take that back to the CRO and say, like, tell me where the gap is here. What am I not understanding?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's we hear pretty similar across our customer base. I think where I've seen organizations really struggle is when, and I think this goes to Robbie's point, when you're going to ClinOps and asking them to recount what happened in the study without your own informed view. I think their worldview is I'm here running the trial and I can't recall across the 250 lines of the ClinOps budget. And so coming to them and saying, hey, I've noticed, your biggest variance on the expense side are these activities. What happened in the study? Does this make sense? Should they be charging us for 10, site monitoring visits when we've only activated 2 sites?
Yeah.
I think it's really important that you're showing that you have that context and have done your own homework and you're speaking clinical.
Yeah, and just to further Martin's question, I do a lot of times because we have so many people that we're supporting, we go straight to the head of that clinical organization. A lot of times I've had the most success getting more context on what's happening on the ground from the clinical trial managers, just so you're aware of who the right people are to speak with.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One other, and I think, Josh, you're asking, this is fascinating because, Auxilius is finance and accounting software. We think about accruals all day. We were sort of focused here on forecasting, which is great. Auxilius thinks you should have, and I think this is probably Robbie agrees, you should have your own view of the world to be able to calibrate against what the vendor's saying from an accrual standpoint. I actually want to ask Robbie, because I think this is an organizational question. One thing that we found pretty fascinating across our 70 customers is that the roles and responsibilities between FP&A and accounting are wildly variable. And so, and for example, right, we have a Robbie who knows so much about the actuals and is using that to develop his forecast. We see a lot of FP&A folks who are actually responsible for the accruals, and they provide that expense estimate to accounting. Robbie, can you talk just about kind of your experience? When have you been responsible for the accruals versus just the forecast? Any kind of tips for how another dynamic we see is that finance and accounting don't necessarily read off the same sheet of music. So when there is that difference between functions, what have you seen work?
I've always explained that, a lot of times the financial planning team, they're focused on internal reporting. And so how I try to, I don't want to make this sound like I'm kind of, what's the word? Trying to get the accounting team to do my bidding. But I try to, what I try to show is basically, what is meaningful to the functions for them to be able to manage their finances, right? And sometimes that's a level of detail that maybe the accounting team might not care for. Maybe it's not in their threshold, but from a reporting perspective, it's meaningful. And sometimes the converse is true, right? Like sometimes the accounting team might be putting way too much information, and they don't realize that it's actually causing so much more work on their end when on the internal reporting stuff, managing the functions, they don't really care about that level of detail, right? So I think it's finding that balance based on the company that you're at, because it is company specific, it is people specific, but it always goes, to me, it boils down to the question of what is meaningful data to the people that you are ultimately serving. And if you're transacting too much, probably worth asking why, because maybe doing more work that's not a value add versus like truly putting in information that can be utilized across the board.
That's a great point. This might be a good juncture to pop up our poll question, Peter, if we could, to ask the group when it comes to, because we're kind of getting into granular versus category level expensing, and there's variations of that, different needs depending upon organization and stakeholder. Would love to ask the group here if we can pop up that poll. If you could have a recalibrated clinical trial expense forecast done automatically on a monthly basis that's using actuals, would you reforecast more often with that data at your fingertips? So thinking about more of a granular level there and on a real-time basis.
Yeah, and I think also just a little more context to this question. We ask all of our customers this question, and we see such a blended response. And it's really about, if you're on a quarterly cadence, do you want the opportunity to have a more often calibrated forecast?
Yeah, I remember you asking me this, and I was just like, yeah, why not? Like, why wouldn't I want to reforecast? But then I guess it's a question of what the purpose is, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because from when we provide forecasts to the management team, it's quarterly, typically quarterly, and that's what stays. That's the new measure, or whatever it is, right? But personally, as somebody who likes to challenge the assumptions and like what people say, I like having information at my fingertips that allow me to determine whether that last forecast that I provided, if there's some truth behind it or it's still lagging, right? So I'll even if I do project and provide information on a quarterly to the management team, I personally still project monthly to see how different, especially if I had information that might change the trajectory of my projections. I don't see why, personally, I would much rather be able to be proactive about managing my financials.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's interesting is that's if you have a the bandwidth, B, the tools. And I think it is very much when what we hear is that quarterly forecasting is a result of just the like bandwidth and data and tool set availability. And doing a bottoms up build on a quarterly basis is hard when, to your point earlier, Robbie, you're incorporating change orders into an Excel model that is getting like increasingly unwieldy.
Yeah. I see Slavam put a message here, which is true. Too much monthly noise, and that's absolutely true. There can be a lot of noise on a monthly basis, and if I didn't have a tool that kind of like refreshes automatically without me having to, if I had to intervene all the time, absolutely, I would just stick with quarterly. But if there's something there that kind of like runs, and I can just take a look at it, and whether I take that new forecast or not, but just to have that information to help question I think would be, to me, great. Hey, Slava.
So, Erin, what do you think? This might be a good juncture to pivot over and start because we're seeing some questions here. And I think all of what we're talking about is, there's this kind of dichotomy between, yes, like that granular data can hold a lot of power, not only to being able to understand where you stand at a point in time in your trial, but organizationally, like having that bigger picture strategic forecast that is rooted in a source of truth that is evidence-based. It's hard to do that if it's manual and we're triangulating a lot of data sources. So maybe this is a good time we can show a little bit of how that can be done in the tool.
Great. Yeah, let's do that. And Robbie, obviously also Sharon, feel free to jump in.
Sure.
I think what we were going to try to do today is, Robbie's provided us some awesome kind of examples and has framed the problem pretty well in terms of the challenges that sponsors face overall. Where I'd love to spend time today is just to kind of show you how we think about solving that via the Auxilius system, but also sharing like how our customers are leveraging Auxilius or whatever they're leveraging to get the answers to the questions that Robbie's framed. So let me okay. Now I'm going to start here at the portfolio level view. The reality is, and we didn't get into the poll question on sort of the like macro, what are big FP&A meaty strategic challenges. But I think what we would have heard from you, our guests, is that being able to articulate what the portfolio, being able to articulate, here it is. Evaluating new financing options, you're going to need a like pretty clear idea of what you're going to spend that cash on going forward. And then we love hearing reducing and streamlining R&D costs, and we'll show you kind of how. But Obviously, there's a lot of importance at the portfolio level to have an answer on what's happening. And so starting here is just the like overall view of everything that's happening across your portfolio. Now, the reality is, and the reason that most sponsors are forecasting at the trial level is because there's so much nuance at the trial level. Obviously, there are, as Robbie's talked about, idiosyncratic elements of trials. The enrollment curve is so much going to dictate what's happening from the cost distribution standpoint. And so the Auxilius system is really configured around giving you answers at the trial level. We understand that you need to be able to report out at that portfolio level, but I really want to kind of dig into the nuance at the trial level. So today, we're not going to get into our kind of end-to-end accrual solution, really just focus on a couple of use cases on the forecasting side. Finally, maybe just a like quick lightning round question for Robbie. Forecasting pass-through costs. We get this a lot. We have our own view, but what's your go-to?
We base it on actuals and see how they're doing and speak. It's not a great process. So I'm looking to see what you guys could provide in that regard.
Yeah. I mean, my answer is going to be it very much depends on the nature of the pass-through costs. We see a lot of pass-through costs that, and again, like a third-party lab that's being managed, a lot of those can be described best by the patient curve, and then we can see some, tie that to either kind of a visit schedule if there is an indication in the actual patient travel. Usually is pretty well indicated by the patient curve. CROs who are putting like a weird printing fee as a pass-through cost. Your guess is as good as mine, right? That's one of those, like, it's kind of, you go back and to Robbie's point, you recontract and say, stop putting that weird stuff.
Hopefully those are small enough.
Yeah. All right.
Erin and Robbie, thank you. We have 2 minutes here. If there are any additional questions, I just want to thank everyone for the time. It was good to kind of start with thinking about, broadly speaking, forecasting and FP&A for clinical stage biotech companies today. And thinking of, your companies as the jet, and thinking of somebody like Robbie and the heads of finance and CFOs as the pilot. The engine or the heart of this is honestly the R&D and the clinical trial costs. And that's why we wanted to delve into that today, because it's really important, to be able to guide the direction of your organization with a real handle on what's happening, both in actual real time and being able to predict upwards of 5 years out. So appreciated the view that Erin, that you were able to show in product at Auxilius. And again, we're available if you guys have questions or want to learn more. And Robbie, really appreciate your time and sharing your insights as a tenured executive in this industry that's seen a lot. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And for those who tuned in, please connect with me on LinkedIn and share your experiences as well. God knows there's many approaches.
That's right.
Hopefully we can share some knowledge.
Yep, absolutely. And thanks for the questions, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Hi, everyone.